The sky over Los Angeles shimmered with twilight, casting golden hues across the towering buildings and rolling hills as the city prepared for one of the biggest film premieres of the year. Limousines lined up outside the Dolby Theater, paparazzi flashes ignited like a storm of lightning, and fans screamed behind metal barricades hoping to catch a glimpse of Hollywood royalty. This night wasn't just another red carpet event. It was the night, the one everyone in the industry had marked on their calendars. It was the premiere of The Last Letter, the most anticipated emotional drama of the decade, starring none other than Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. But no one could have imagined that what was supposed to be a celebration of cinematic brilliance would become the night Hollywood held its breath, and then went utterly silent. Keanu arrived first. He stepped out of the black Maybach, dressed in an effortlessly classic black tuxedo, his salt and pepper hair brushing his collar, eyes soft but alert under the lights. As always, there was something different about him. The humility in his walk, the way he greeted the fans with gentle smiles and took time to sign a few posters before facing the cameras. Keanu Reeves was never one to steal the spotlight, and yet wherever he went, the spotlight followed. Reporters shouted questions, some about the movie, others more personal. "Keanu, who are you here with tonight? Any special guest with you?" He gave no answer, only a calm nod and his usual quiet charm. Then came Sandra. Her car pulled up and the screaming grew louder. She emerged in a dark crimson gown that hugged her silhouette like a secret. Her hair swept to one side, her eyes outlined with smoky elegance. She looked both like a movie star and like someone who didn't need to be one. That's what made Sandra Bullock different. She had grace that didn't shout, presence that didn't demand, and a beauty that came from somewhere deeper than makeup and lighting. Keanu had once said in an old interview, "Sandra is the kind of woman who can change the temperature of a room just by walking in." And tonight, she did just that. As Sandra made her way toward the red carpet, the crowd gasped, not because she looked stunning, but because instead of posing for solo shots as usual, she walked straight toward Keanu. Without saying a word, she took his hand, not as a gesture for the cameras, not as a staged publicity move, but with a quiet confidence that hinted at something more, something real. The cameras went wild. Flash after flash lit up their entwined hands. The reporters were frozen for a moment before erupting into a storm of questions. "Sandra, are you two dating? Is this official? Keanu, are you confirming something tonight?" But still no answer. Keanu only glanced at Sandra and she looked up at him. They shared a look, one of those deep, unspoken connections that no lens could truly capture. Then together they walked down the carpet, hand in hand, smiling, calm, unshaken. Hollywood had seen many couples, many rumors, many red carpet surprises, but never something quite like this. Inside the theater, whispers passed like ripples through an ocean of tuxedos and gowns. Directors, producers, fellow actors, everyone was guessing. Had they been together all this time? Were they finally admitting it? What was this night really about? Only two people knew the truth, and only one of them was about to reveal it. As the premiere began, the auditorium dimmed, the screen flickered to life, and the film unfolded, a moving story about love, loss, and forgiveness. Keanu played a quiet widower trying to reconnect with his estranged daughter through letters left behind by his late wife. Sandra portrayed a grieving counselor, unknowingly helping him heal while hiding a devastating secret of her own. Their performances were raw, haunting, utterly human. There wasn't a dry eye in the theater by the final scene. And as the credits rolled, the audience stood, applauding not just a film, but something they couldn't quite name. Something that had hovered above the evening from the start. Then came the surprise. After the film, the host walked onto the stage, preparing to invite the cast and crew for a final bow. But Keanu stepped forward, taking the microphone gently from the host's hand. There was a nervous laugh among the audience. Keanu never spoke at these things. He wasn't a man of speeches. That was what made what happened next so unforgettable. He began slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you for being here tonight," he said. "This film means a lot to us. It's about healing. It's about second chances. It's about how some letters carry truths we're afraid to say out loud." The room was silent. He looked to his right. Sandra stood just off stage, watching. "And I guess," he continued, "I have one of those letters too, a truth I've never said out loud." Now the silence was thick enough to cut. "I've been lucky in life," Keanu said. "I've played heroes, misfits, outlaws. I've lived many lives on screen, but the greatest role I've ever been given is being a husband." A collective gasp filled the room. Keanu looked directly at Sandra. To the woman who taught me what strength really is, who showed me grace even when I didn't deserve it, who stood beside me in every storm. Sandra, I love you, and I want the world to know we're married. You could hear the air leave the room. Not a single whisper, not a single sound. Hollywood, the land of drama, speculation, and performance, stood absolutely still. Keanu extended his hand and Sandra stepped onto the stage, her eyes shining. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She reached him, took his hand again, and leaned into his shoulder. The audience erupted, not in a frenzy, but in a heartfelt, stunned standing ovation. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This wasn't a headline grab. This was love, raw and rare, revealed not through tabloids, but through trust. For years, they had shielded it, not because they were ashamed, but because some things are too precious to be paraded. And now, on this night, this premiere night, they had chosen to share their truth. But what the world didn't know, not yet, was how this story began. How years of pain, distance, and sacrifice had shaped their bond into something unbreakable. That their marriage wasn't the result of a whirlwind romance, but of long years of friendship, mutual respect, heartbreak, reunion, and the kind of quiet understanding that only two souls who have suffered can truly share. The real story wasn't about the night Hollywood went silent. It was about the 1,000 moments before it that led them here. And that's where it begins. Long before the glitz of the premiere night, before the ovation and the thunderous silence that followed Keanu's revelation, there existed a letter. A simple folded piece of paper, written in hurried yet careful penmanship, resting for years in a drawer no one opened anymore. It was never mailed, never read. It was a letter meant to explain everything, but life in its cruel dance had other plans. This letter was born not out of joy, but of heartbreak. And yet it carried within it the seed of something greater than forgiveness. A truth too raw to be spoken, yet too powerful to be ignored. It all began nearly 10 years earlier when Keanu and Sandra were filming a small independent project in Vancouver. It wasn't a blockbuster. It wasn't a commercial success. But it was the film that changed everything. Not because of its script, but because of what bloomed behind the scenes, slowly, cautiously, as if neither of them could quite trust the pull they felt. At first, they danced around each other like cautious flames. They had worked together before. Everyone knew about Speed in the lake house and how their chemistry was undeniable. But on this smaller set, away from the studios and executives, away from the Hollywood expectations, Keanu saw Sandra in a way the world hadn't. Not as America's sweetheart or the glamorous star, but as a woman quietly battling grief of her own. Her mother had just passed. Her heart was heavy, but she never let it show. She would arrive on set early, always with coffee for the crew. She stayed late, learning lines not just for herself, but to run them with younger actors struggling with their confidence. Sandra didn't act like a star. She acted like a human being, a rare one. Keanu, too, was grieving. He always was in some way, the loss of his daughter, the passing of his partner, Jennifer. The wounds that time couldn't mend. He had learned to live with silence as his companion and sadness as his rhythm. But Sandra brought something different, a spark, not the loud kind, not the kind that demanded attention. It was the quiet kind, like the first candle lit in a dark room, steady, gentle, relentless. They became inseparable on set, long walks after shooting, shared dinners at quiet places no one recognized them, conversations that didn't shy away from the painful parts of life. And slowly something real formed, not a whirlwind romance, but something rooted, grounded, honest. Then came the night everything changed. It was raining, the kind of rain Vancouver is known for, constant, melodic. They were supposed to meet for dinner at a small bistro Sandra loved, but she never showed up. Keanu waited for almost an hour, pacing in front of the restaurant, soaked to the bone, phone in hand, checking for a message that never came. The next day, she returned to set distant, distracted. Her scenes were professional as always, but her eyes no longer lingered on him between takes. She avoided his questions, laughed a little too loud when someone else made a joke, and when the shoot wrapped, she left with only a brief hug. No goodbye dinner, no closure. Keanu was confused, hurt but too proud to chase, too used to people walking away. He returned to LA, threw himself into work, and tried to forget her. That's when he wrote the letter. He didn't want to send a message over text, not something this real. He didn't want to call and get her voicemail. He wanted her to read what he had to say in his words, in his own hand. The letter was short, but every word weighed 100 pounds. Sandra, I don't know why you walked away. Maybe I don't deserve to know. But if I did something wrong, I wish you'd let me fix it. If I said something that hurt you, I wish I could take it back. I miss the version of myself that I saw reflected in your eyes. I haven't felt that safe in years. If this was nothing to you, I'll accept it. But if there's even a small part of you that felt what I did, don't let silence be the final answer. Keanu. He sealed the letter, stamped it, and placed it in the small tray on his desk where outgoing mail went. But the next morning, something in him hesitated. Doubt crept in like fog. What if she had moved on already? What if it was better not to stir old wounds? He never mailed it. The letter stayed there untouched for years. Time marched on, and so did their lives. Sandra adopted 2 beautiful children. Keanu did a few more films, dove into charity work, lost himself in motorcycles and solitude. They'd see each other occasionally at award shows, always polite, always smiling, but never alone, never close. Then came the tragedy. Sandra's partner at the time was caught in a betrayal so public, so humiliating it broke her spirit. The tabloids feasted on it. Friends she thought were family disappeared, and through it all she never said a word to the press. But Keanu sent her flowers. No note, just lilies, the same kind she used to tuck behind her ear during their Vancouver days. She knew. She called him weeks later, not to thank him, but to ask if he wanted to go for coffee. It was the first time they'd spoken one-on-one in over 6 years. They met at a quiet bookshop cafe in Pasadena, both older, wiser, more broken, but somehow more whole. They talked for hours, not about what happened, but about where they were now, about healing, about how some people disappear from your life, but not from your soul. It wasn't love at first sight anymore. It was something deeper, love at second understanding. They began to meet more often, always away from cameras, always without expectation. They weren't trying to rekindle something. They were trying to rebuild something better. And one evening, after a walk through Griffith Park under a crescent moon, Sandra stopped and said, "There's something I never told you." She pulled out a small envelope, worn, creased, almost falling apart. "I found this in my old Vancouver coat a few months after filming Wrapped. I'd written it the night I didn't show up." Keanu looked down. The envelope had his name on it. Inside was a letter she'd written that night. "Keanu, I couldn't meet you because I was scared. Not of you, of myself, of what I was feeling. You remind me of everything that's real, and I've spent so long hiding behind what's safe. I think I'm falling in love with you, and I'm terrified I'll lose you once you know that. Sandra." Keanu's hands trembled, not because of what the letter said, but because he remembered his letter still sitting unread in a drawer back home. He smiled. I guess we both owed each other some honesty. The next day, he gave her his letter. They didn't speak for a while after that, not out of awkwardness but reverence, as if words were too small to contain what had just happened. From that day on, they weren't just 2 friends rediscovering each other. They were 2 people carrying each other's truths, finally unburdened. Their relationship didn't explode like fireworks. It unfolded like dawn, slow, warm, inevitable. They married in private, no guests, no press, just a beach, a handwritten vow, and the sound of waves sealing a promise 10 years in the making. But they made one pact that day, that no one would know until the world needed to. They wanted their love to grow away from the noise, the judgment, the questions. They wanted to protect it, not out of shame, but reverence. And for years they did just that. Quiet dinners, secret getaways, late-night calls during shoots. He would call her his lighthouse, she his gravity. But even the most sacred stories must one day step into the light. And that's why Keanu chose that premiere night, not for drama, not for headlines, but because the film they made together echoed the very journey they had walked. It was the right time, the right moment, the right truth. But what neither of them knew was that someone from Sandra's past had followed her story closely. Someone who once tried to ruin her now had dangerous intentions. And as their love story began to shine publicly, shadows from the past started to rise again. And that's where we go next. Fame, no matter how gently carried, is never weightless. It clings to people like smoke, permeating their quietest moments, staining their joys with questions, and often turning love into speculation. For years, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had defied the gravity of that world, anchoring their relationship in secrecy and sacredness. But the moment Keanu stood on that stage and spoke the truth, "Sandra, I love you, and I want the world to know we're married," the floodgates opened. In a single breath, they had pulled back the curtain on something pure. But what neither of them could have foreseen was how quickly the wolves would circle the fire. The news exploded across every screen and device within minutes. Keanu Reeves confirms secret marriage to Sandra Bullock. Hollywood's most private couple comes clean. 10-year secret marriage stuns the world. The headlines weren't lies, but they weren't the truth either. They missed the pain, the patience, the letters that were never sent, the rain-soaked heartbreak, and the whispered promises made under starlight. The public wanted fairy tales, but the press wanted scandal. And someone was ready to feed it to them. 3 days after the premiere, while the internet was still ablaze with admiration and intrigue, an anonymous source reached out to a major tabloid, offering what they claimed was proof that the marriage was a cover-up and that Keanu was Sandra's first choice. It was an explosive claim, one built on a single photo, taken years ago, of Sandra embracing a man from behind during her darker, more vulnerable period. The image was harmless by most standards. No date, no context. But the headline twisted it. Sandra's real love, the man before Keanu she tried to forget. The article dropped like a bomb. Within hours, it was trending. YouTube commentators began speculating. Podcasts dissected the image. Bloggers wrote venom-laced think pieces. None of them knew the truth, that the man in the photo was a close family friend who had comforted her after the betrayal by her former partner, long before she and Keanu found their way back to each other. But truth had no value in the face of viral curiosity. Keanu read the article at 2:30 in the morning. He was alone in their quiet Malibu home, the waves outside trying in vain to soothe his racing thoughts. The photo didn't upset him. He trusted Sandra beyond words. What hurt was the feeling of violation, that the life they had protected so fiercely was now meat for the wolves. When Sandra woke later that morning, she already knew. She had seen it on her phone. Her silence at breakfast said everything. Her eyes, once soft with joy, now carried an edge of steel. She wasn't angry, she was exhausted. "I knew this would happen," she said, pushing her coffee away. "I knew the moment we stepped into the light, someone would try to make us regret it." Keanu reached across the table and took her hand. Do I what? Regret it?" She looked at him, really looked. The man who had stood by her through storms, who had never once flinched even when her life unraveled, who had written her a letter he never mailed and waited 10 years without bitterness. "No," she whispered, "but I hate that the truth has to fight this hard to be heard." Keanu made a decision that day. He called his publicist and canceled all scheduled interviews. He told the studio he wouldn't be doing any follow-up press tour. When they protested, citing contract obligations, he replied simply, "Then sue me, I'm not selling my marriage." But silence didn't make the noise stop. In fact, it got worse. A second leak came a week later. This time it was a manipulated voicemail, a chopped, edited recording allegedly from Sandra to an unnamed man spliced to sound like she was confessing she had settled in her marriage. It was a complete fabrication, but that didn't stop the media from running with it. "Sandra Bullock's regret," the headlines read. "Marriage in trouble already." Keanu and Sandra sat in their living room, side by side on the couch, listening to the altered audio on his phone. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just closed her eyes. "This isn't about us anymore," she said. "It's about making money off us." Keanu stood and paced, the fury in him rare but unmistakable. "Then let's take that away from them." She looked up. "How?" He stopped, turned to face her. "We tell the real story." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "You want to what? Sit down with Oprah, do a documentary?" "No," he said. "Something quieter, something true. We write it, just us. No networks, no deals, just our story, for anyone who wants to hear the truth, not the version that sells." That night they began. They lit a fire, opened a bottle of red wine, and pulled out notebooks. Side by side they started writing. Not just about their marriage, but everything. The missed letters, the grief, the failed relationships, the personal demons, the things they were too scared to tell even themselves. It wasn't easy. Keanu wrote about the guilt he still carried from his daughter's death, how he had once believed he wasn't capable of being loved, how Sandra had changed that. Sandra wrote about the betrayal that nearly broke her, about the fear of becoming vulnerable again, about how Keanu had slowly helped her believe in trust once more. They wrote about small things, too, the way she still tucked her knees up when watching movies, how he always paused before speaking, how they both hated cilantro and loved thunderstorms. Their story wasn't a fairy tale, it was a survival tale. One of two broken people who didn't fix each other, but chose to walk together, scars and all. And when it was done, they published it themselves. No fanfare, no endorsements, Just a simple PDF, free to read, uploaded to a quiet blog with a title that said everything. No one knew until we were ready. It went viral not because of clickbait, but because of honesty. Fans who read it felt something rare, realness. It wasn't about fame. It was about the truth that most people forget. Love isn't loud. It's patient. It's quiet. It's choosing someone over and over, even when the world tries to rewrite your story. But not everyone was pleased. The anonymous leaker whose fabricated evidence had fueled weeks of tabloid chaos suddenly found themselves exposed. A young former assistant to Sandra's disgraced ex-partner had been paid to leak old photos, edit audio, and create fake timelines. When confronted, he confessed. The story exploded again, but this time justice was the headline. Truth wins. Keanu and Sandra clear their name with grace. Hollywood's most private couple shows us how to fight back, with dignity. The same tabloids that had once tried to bury them were now printing apologies. But Keanu and Sandra didn't celebrate. They didn't post selfies. They didn't gloat. They simply turned off their phones, packed 2 bags, and disappeared for a while. No press knew where they went. Some speculated Iceland. Others whispered about a cabin in Montana. The truth was they didn't want to be found. Because what they had realized through all the chaos was that their love didn't need defending. It didn't need explaining. It just needed space. They returned months later, hand in hand, walking into a quiet benefit gala for orphaned children. No cameras, no announcements, just silent support. And when someone asked Sandra how she had endured the storm, she simply said, "Because I had someone beside me who never let go." But little did they know, the world had one more surprise in store. One that would test not their love, but their ability to forgive. Because hidden in the shadows of their past, someone from Keanu's life was about to return. And this time it wouldn't be a scandal. It would be a plea, a cry for help. And Keanu would have to make the hardest decision of his life. The storm had passed, or so they thought. Keanu and Sandra had returned to the quiet of their lives with renewed strength. Their love, once a secret garden tucked behind stone walls, had now bloomed in the open. And even after the fires of media intrusion and betrayal, they stood tall, 2 souls who had refused to bend to the noise of the world. Their truth had been written in their own words, and that truth had prevailed. But as life often reminds those who feel they have finally found peace, sometimes the past doesn't knock to be let in. Sometimes it breaks the door down without warning. It was a late October morning in New York City. The autumn breeze painted the streets with gold and rust-colored leaves. Sandra was in the kitchen of their brownstone, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for a hearty soup, her comfort dish during the colder months. Keanu sat by the window, a rare smile playing on his lips as he read an old poetry collection, dog-eared and faded. It was one of those days that felt too perfect to be real. And then the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate taps at the front door. Not the quick, eager knock of a friend or the distracted rap of a deliveryman. It was heavy. Keanu looked up, instinct flickering across his face. He stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Standing on the other side was a man he hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. His name was Nathan Griggs. And once upon a time, he had been Keanu's closest friend. His brother not by blood, but by fire. They had met during one of Keanu's darkest chapters, after the death of his daughter after Jennifer's fatal car accident, when the pain was still fresh and the world felt too sharp to touch. Nathan had been there. A fellow actor turned screenwriter, a man with demons of his own, but a heart that had once saved Keanu from complete collapse. But then Nathan disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace. Until now. He looked older. His beard was patchy, his clothes worn. There were deep lines in his face that weren't there before. His eyes, once electric with creativity, now seemed clouded with regret. Keanu didn't say anything. "Hey man," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I'm the last person you ever expected to see." Keanu's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening on the doorknob. "You should go." "Please," Nathan said quickly, stepping forward. "Just give me 10 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Sandra appeared in the hallway, sensing the tension. Her gaze flicked between Keanu and the stranger. She didn't recognize him, but the look in Keanu's eyes told her this wasn't a fan or a reporter. This was something much heavier. Keanu finally stepped aside. 10 minutes, he said, nothing more. They sat in the living room. Sandra stayed nearby, watching from the threshold. Keanu crossed his arms, expression unreadable. "I've been clean for 4 years," Nathan began. "That doesn't erase what I did, I know, but I had to start somewhere." Keanu said nothing. Nathan looked down. "I abandoned you, and I abandoned myself. I took the money you lent me for rehab and blew it. I left without a word because I didn't want you to see how far I had fallen." Keanu's voice was quiet. "You didn't fall, you chose to disappear. I needed you, and you disappeared." Nathan's eyes filled with guilt. "I know, and I've lived with that every day." There was a long silence, the kind that held years of pain between its folds. "I read the blog," Nathan said. "About you and Sandra, about your story. It made me remember who I used to be, who I was when I had people that believed in me, and now I'm just trying to come back to that." Keanu's eyes softened slightly, but his guard was still up. "Why now?" Nathan looked up. "Because I'm dying." The room froze. Nathan swallowed. "Stage 4 liver failure. I waited too long to fix what I broke. I have maybe a few months left. I'm not here to beg for anything. I just wanted you to know that I was proud of you. That even when I was in the darkest places, I would see your name somewhere and think, he made it. He found light. And maybe that gave me a reason to try again, even if I failed." Sandra stepped in slowly, her hand resting on Keanu's shoulder. There was no playbook for this moment. Pain doesn't come with instructions. Forgiveness doesn't arrive dressed like a saint. Sometimes it crawls in through the back door, worn and broken, asking for a place to rest before it's too late. Keanu nodded once, just once, and in that nod something opened, not absolution, not closure, but space. They let Nathan stay in the guest room that night. Sandra cooked. Nathan, once the center of every room, sat quietly, humbled. Over the next few weeks, a strange rhythm formed. Nathan didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't ask for anything, but he helped. He fixed the leaky sink without being asked. He cleaned the garden. He cooked breakfast some mornings and left it warming on the stove before anyone else was awake. He was fading, and yet in those final months he shone brighter than he ever had. And then one night, as the snow began to fall over New York, he knocked on Keanu's study door and said, "I have something for you." He handed him a thick envelope. Inside was a screenplay, handwritten, raw, emotional, titled simply, The Letter. Nathan smiled. It's the story of two people who loved each other through silence, and one friend who almost ruined it by forgetting what love really looks like. Keanu's voice cracked. "You wrote this for me." "I wrote it for us," Nathan replied, "so no one else forgets." Nathan passed away in his sleep 3 weeks later. Keanu held his hand as he took his final breath. The funeral was private. No headlines, no cameras, just a quiet man laid to rest by the friend who had once thought he'd never speak to him again. But out of death, something new was born. Keanu and Sandra took the script Nathan left behind and decided to produce it as a tribute, not just to him, but to the parts of themselves they thought had been lost forever. The movie premiered a year later. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't filled with explosions or stunts. It was just true. And when the lights came up, the audience wept, not because of tragedy, but because of truth. Because sometimes, the most powerful story isn't the one where everything goes right. It's the one where two people find their way back, again and again, despite the world, despite the noise, despite the pain. And when Keanu walked off the stage after the premiere, Sandra was waiting. She took his hand, leaned in, and whispered, "You didn't just make a movie, you kept a promise." And Keanu, eyes glistening, whispered back, "We both did." There are moments in every life where the world seems to pause, not out of awe, but from the terror of uncertainty, where time slows not for beauty, but because the heart is holding its breath, praying that what it's witnessing isn't real. Keanu Reeves had endured pain before. He had lived through the agony of loss, through funerals, through betrayal, through silence. But nothing prepared him for the moment he came home and found the house empty and Sandra gone without a trace. It was a chilly Friday afternoon in late March, and the city hummed with its usual rhythm outside. Keanu had been filming an interview across town, an intimate sit-down with a small production crew that he had agreed to, only because it was about Nathan's screenplay and nothing else. For the first time in a long time, Keanu had begun to open up in public, not for the sake of relevance, but for the memory of a friend who'd found redemption too late. That interview had been heartfelt, honest. But even as he answered the questions, something gnawed at him, an ache he couldn't name. as if a string tied between his chest and Sandra's heart had been pulled tight, vibrating with the tension of something he couldn't see. When he returned home that evening, the house was still, too still. No soup simmering, no quiet humming from the kitchen, no smell of coffee or books opened on the living room table, just silence. He called her name once, twice. No response. At first, he tried to brush it off. Maybe she had gone for a walk. Maybe she had gone to the bookstore 2 blocks down or taken the car for groceries. But as the minutes turned to hours, the silence thickened. Her phone was off. Her keys were missing. Her bag gone, yet all her favorite jewelry, her latest journal, and even the soft sweater she always wore on chilly evenings still hung untouched in their places. Keanu called her assistant, her manager, her best friend. No one had heard from her, no messages, no emails, nothing. The police refused to treat it as a missing person case until 48 hours had passed. They said she was an adult, that she had the right to go off the grid. But Keanu knew Sandra. She would never vanish without saying a word, not to him. He didn't sleep that night. He walked the streets himself, hood up, unshaven, invisible in the city he had once called home. He checked bookstores, coffee shops, even the hospital emergency rooms. At one point, he stood across the street from a small shelter she used to volunteer at in secret, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, anything. But there was no sign, just the cold wind and the burning fear he hadn't felt in years. By the second day, the press had caught on. Has Sandra Bullock gone missing? Keanu's wife vanishes without a trace. Hollywood's quiet couple faces nightmare. But Keanu didn't care about the noise. All he cared about was finding her. On the 3rd morning, he received a letter. Not an email, not a voicemail. A handwritten envelope slipped under the front door. Inside was a folded note, written in Sandra's familiar cursive, 5 lines. Don't look for me. I'm safe. I need to find something I lost long ago, before I can be fully yours. Please trust me. Yes. The world tilted. Keanu read the note a dozen times, memorized it, analyzed every stroke of her pen, every pause in her words. It didn't sound like a cry for help, but it didn't sound like Sandra either. She had already found her peace, hadn't she? He didn't know what to do. Should he respect her request and stay still? Or should he follow his instinct, the same instinct that told him their love had survived storms, lies, public betrayals, and even death? He sat in the garden where she used to read in the afternoons, and as the wind rustled through the trees, he remembered something Nathan had once told him during their roughest days. Sometimes people disappear not because they're lost, but because they need to test if anyone cares enough to search. Keanu stood up. He was going to find her, but not through the press, not through police reports or internet sleuths. He would find her the way he had always connected to her, through silence, through symbols, through memory. He returned to their old Vancouver apartment, the one they had stayed in during that first film shoot a decade ago. The building had changed owners, but the old landlord still remembered the quiet couple who used to cook late at night and left behind a shelf full of poetry books. Keanu found a note tucked between 2 books, letters to a young poet. It wasn't signed, but the writing was hers. If I vanish, find me where the sun first kissed our regret. He knew what that meant. 2 days later, he boarded a flight to a small coastal town in Maine. It was where they had once taken a road trip after wrapping that film. A quiet weekend of foggy beaches and whispered conversations. They had stood by the lighthouse at sunrise, and she had said, "This feels like the beginning of something that will take us years to understand." He found her on the 3rd morning, standing at that very spot. She was wearing the same long coat she had worn back then, her hair tied back, no makeup, just Sandra. She turned before he even called her name, as if she had been expecting him all along. "I asked you not to come," she said, voice soft. "And I never listen," Keanu replied gently. She smiled, but it was tired. They sat in silence on the rocky shore for almost half an hour. No words, just waves. Finally, she spoke. "I thought I was healed, I thought I was whole. But when the world started listening to us, I panicked. Not because of what they thought, but because I realized there's still a version of me I've been hiding, from you, from myself." Keanu looked at her. "You don't owe me perfection, just honesty." She nodded slowly. "I wasn't just broken when we met, I was bitter. I had resentment that I never unpacked. And I realized I can't walk into this next chapter of our lives until I let that go. I had to come here to remember who I was before I became this. Keanu reached into his coat and pulled something out. A letter, folded, faded. The same one he had written her a decade ago, the one that never reached her. I kept this, he said, because even when I didn't understand why you left, I never stopped choosing you. Tears streamed down her cheeks. And for the first time in weeks, she leaned against him. They didn't return to New York immediately. Instead, they stayed in Maine for several weeks. No press, no announcements, just two people starting over without erasing anything. They rebuilt not from scratch, but from the truth. And when they returned, they did so stronger. Because love isn't a grand gesture. It's the decision to stay, to search, to sit in silence until the other is ready to speak. And Keanu Reeves had stayed. He had searched. He had never stopped choosing her. The night was velvet black outside the New York Public Library, where old stone columns gleamed under the golden light of chandeliers, and a soft hush fell over a crowd unlike any other. Inside, the air buzzed not with celebrity or politics, but something far more sacred, truth. It was the annual Humanity Through Art Gala, a gathering of storytellers, survivors, poets, actors, and healers. A place where wounds were not hidden but honored, where the spotlight didn't burn, it illuminated. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock weren't scheduled to speak. In fact, they had only agreed to attend quietly, as patrons of the foundation that had helped rebuild shelters for women and children Sandra had personally supported over the years. Keanu, on the other hand, had anonymously donated millions to hospices, to cancer research, to trauma recovery clinics, never asking for acknowledgement, never letting the world attach his name to his compassion. But that night something shifted. Midway through the event, after stories of courage and music that made hearts bleed and mend in the same breath, the host stepped up to the podium and said, "There's someone here tonight who didn't plan to speak, but we believe the story he and Sandra have lived through these past years, quietly, courageously, deserves to be heard. Mr. Keanu Reeves, if you'll join us." A ripple passed through the audience, a soft gasp. Sandra turned toward Keanu, eyes wide, surprised. But Keanu didn't hesitate. He stood slowly, adjusted his black suit jacket, kissed Sandra's forehead, and made his way to the podium. He didn't read from a paper. He didn't clear his throat. He just looked up and began. "I used to think pain was a private thing," he said, his voice calm, deep, reflective. "I thought it was something you survived alone. That strength meant silence. That real love, if it existed, wouldn't need to be seen or spoken about. But then I met someone who taught me that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who let themselves be seen, especially when it hurts." His eyes scanned the audience. "She's sitting right there," he continued, looking toward Sandra. "And I owe her more than just love. I owe her my life. Not because she saved me, but because she reminded me I was worth saving." The room was breathless. "We wrote a story together," he went on. "Not a movie, a real story. A story of missed chances, silent years, private healing, and the courage to step back into the light when every part of us wanted to remain in the shadows." His hands tightened slightly at the edge of the podium. "I never told anyone this before, but when we first met I was a broken man. I smiled on red carpets, but I hadn't smiled in my soul in years. And then one day she brought me a cup of coffee and sat next to me in silence. She didn't try to fix me. She didn't ask questions. She just sat. And sometimes that's all it takes for healing to begin." There were quiet sobs now. "And when she disappeared last year," Keanu said, voice trembling slightly, "I was reminded again of something I thought I had learned already. Love doesn't hold tightly with fear, it waits with faith." He paused. "I searched for her, not because I didn't trust her, but because I knew. When someone you love goes missing, even into themselves, you don't stop looking, you don't give up. You keep walking, even if it's through the darkest woods of silence." Sandra, now wiping tears, looked at him as if seeing him anew. "And when I found her," Keanu said, smiling through the emotion, "I realized something. We don't just love each other, we choose each other. Again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." He stepped away from the podium, but not before turning back and saying softly, "If there's anyone here tonight who thinks they're too far gone, who thinks their silence is a burden, I promise you, it's not too late. Someone out there is walking toward you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but keep your light on, keep your story alive, because someone, maybe even you, will need it to find their way back." He sat down to thunderous applause, but he didn't smile for the cameras. He only looked at Sandra, who now reached out, took his hand, and kissed it with reverence. The days that followed were unlike anything they had experienced. The speech went viral, not because it was spoken by a celebrity, but because it was spoken by a human being who had survived, who had loved through grief, who had stood still when the world demanded movement, who had searched when silence told him not to. The headlines were different this time. Keanu and Sandra redefine what love looks like. Not a romance, a resurrection. Hollywood's most private couple speaks their truth. He waited, she returned. Together they chose grace. And in schools, shelters, and therapy rooms across the world, people watched the speech and cried, not because it was a love story, but because it reminded them they still had time to write their own. Months later, Sandra released a memoir. But it wasn't a celebrity tell-all. It was titled, The Day I Disappeared and How He Found Me. It was part confession, part gratitude letter to Keanu, and part guidebook for anyone afraid to look in the mirror after trauma. It sold millions, not because of the fame attached to it, but because the honesty was unmistakable. Keanu didn't write a book. He didn't need to. He lived his truth in the way he showed up every single day, not just for Sandra, but for anyone who had ever felt unseen. They weren't perfect. They argued, they disagreed, they needed space sometimes. But what made their story legendary wasn't the absence of struggle, it was the presence of choice. They chose to return, to rebuild, to listen, to love when it was easier to leave. And in that choice, they gave the world something rare, not a Hollywood ending, but a human one. One where two people didn't just survive the fire, they warmed the world with the embers of what remained. The end.